Humans have lived in the Las Vegas Valley for something like 10,000 years. And for much of that time, Agave utahensis, my favorite species of agave, was an important food source. And in fact, even today, evidence of indigenous use of Agave utahensis can be seen throughout its range, particularly up in the Spring Mountains. So today we're going to be talking about agave roasting pits. Indigenous cultures throughout the desert Southwest have used agave for thousands of years, a variety of different species of agave, and they use it for things like food, beverages, and fiber. And in fact, groups like the Hohokam in Arizona actually domesticated and cultivated their own types of agave, their own species of agave, their own cultivars, and farmed them in large irrigated fields and used techniques like rock mulch to preserve moisture. Now, there's no evidence that this happened with Agave utahensis. As far as we know, indigenous groups that utilized it simply harvested it wild and then roasted it. But that roasting process was much the same for them as it was for the other cultures of the Southwest. Basically, a large earthen oven, a large bowl, was dug into the ground, filled with limestone, and limestone was used for its thermal properties. And in fact, most roasting pits can be found in areas where limestone is abundant. And then harvested agave hearts were piled on top of that, a fire was started, and the whole thing was covered with more earth and left to roast for a day or two. Now apparently, I've never had it, but apparently after roasting, agave tastes something like sweet potato or molasses. Now these pits can be found, like I said, literally scattered throughout Agave utahensis' habitat, particularly up in the Spring Mountains. And they're pretty easy to identify as well. They're basically giant bowls, raised circles dug into the earth, covered in fire-cracked limestone. And when you heat limestone up, when you use it in one of these roasting pits, it turns white and cracks into fairly consistent sizes. So these roasting pits are actually pretty recognizable. And archaeological evidence has shown that where these pits are usually parts of larger complexes that have been used by a variety of indigenous groups, going back as far as 5,000 or more years with archaic desert cultures, up through ancestral Puebloan cultures that lived in this area about 1,000 years ago, to the most recent indigenous user of Agave utahensis, and probably the most extensive user, the Southern Paiute. The Southern Paiute actually practiced this wild harvesting and roasting up until the mid-19th century. And they lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle. That is, during the cold winters that we get here in Las Vegas, they would live down in the warm valley floor, and during the really hot summers we get, they would live up in the mountains where it's cool. Agave time is the springtime because that's when it starts to flower and becomes ripe. You see, throughout Agave utahensis' lifetime, it is storing energy in the form of complex carbohydrates called fructans. These fructans are normally indigestible to humans, but Agave utahensis is monocarpic. That means it only flowers once in its whole life. And when it does that, a small, maybe 12-inch plant at most, shoots up a giant 10, 12, 15-foot flower stalk in a single season. And that takes a ton of energy to do. So to power that process, enzymes in the agave's heart, in the agave's rosette and its leaves, convert those fructans to simple sweet sugars. And then the plant sends the sugars into the flower stalk to power that growth and to produce the copious amounts of nectar that the plant uses to attract pollinators. But if you harvest the agave just as it begins to flower, before the flower stalk is fully formed, the sugars are still in the rosette of the plant, they're still in the heart of the plant, and thus the plant will be sweet. So it was that time during the springtime that the Southern Paiute and other indigenous groups would harvest agave. And that's actually a really important time for food for hunter-gatherer populations, because typically by the springtime you've eaten through all or most of your winter food stores, but the spring and summer crops and game aren't ready to harvest yet. So Agave utahensis was ripe and ready to go at a really important time, at a really scarce time. And in fact, these archaeological sites, these complexes of roasting pits, reflect the importance of this plant. They're typically found, obviously, near large agave stands, which makes sense, but they're also found near water sources. If you're going to be camped out somewhere for a couple days, weeks, or more, you're going to need something to drink. And interestingly, rock art is very often also found near these sites. So I have two questions for you that I'd love to see you answer down in the comments. One, have you ever eaten agave? or agave any kind, or agave utahensis specifically. I haven't. I'm very curious about it. I know that, again, I've read that it tastes like molasses or sweet potatoes, and apparently when you chew it up, you end up with a mouthful of insoluble fibrous material that you have to spit out to discard. Those are called quids, and have actually become a really important source of archaeological data for researchers. But I'm curious, have you ever eaten agave or agave utahensis, and what does it taste like? And then the second question that I have for everybody watching this, and thank you for watching this, have you ever just happened across one of these roasting pit sites? Have you ever seen a roasting pit site in the wild? I know that if you hike or you run or you do anything out in the mountains around Las Vegas, it's kind of hard not to, but I'm curious where you're from, if you've ever come across one of these roasting pit sites.